Oh, good evening, everybody. I'm Professor Elaine Stiles. I teach historic preservation here at the School of Architecture, Art, and Historic Preservation, for those of you who don't know me. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker for the SOP lecture series, Dr. Theodore Prudon. Dr. Theodore Prudon is a leading expert on the preservation of modern architecture and a partner of Prudon Partners based in New York City. Born in the Netherlands, Dr. Prudon was educated at the University of Delft and Columbia University, where he studied under James Marston Fitch and received his doctorate. Over the course of his 40-year career, Dr. Prudon has worked on hundreds of preservation projects, including the terracotta restoration of the 54-story Woolworth building, the exterior restoration of the Chrysler building, and the restoration of the 1941 Lascaux townhouse in New York City. Dr. Prudon is a board member of Docomomo International, an organization dedicated to the study of significant works of the modern movement architecture, landscape design, and urban planning around the world. He also serves as the founding president of the Docomomo US chapter, which has championed the preservation of American modernism, ranging from icons such as Boston City Hall to works associated with things like mid-20th century design build movement in Vermont. Dr. Prudon has taught preservation practice as well for more than 30 years. And in his teaching capacity, he splits his time between Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and the Pratt Institute of Architecture's Graduate Program for Historic Preservation. He's also the author of a seminal and award-winning book on preservation of modern architecture, published in 2008. So tonight, Dr. Prudon will present the Tremco Sustainable Practices Partnership Lecture on modernism, architecture, and wellness. So please join me in welcoming Theo Prudon to Radcliffe.
Thank you very much. You can hear me? Great. So what I'm going to talk about today are three things. Talk about perceptions, talk a little bit about wellness and architecture, and a little bit about the kind of challenges that we're facing today. But in the beginning, I want to start out, the outline. The question sort of what is heritage? Sort of all in a preservation program, we spend a great deal of time thinking about what that heritage is. And so I want to share with you coming to this country and sort of being exposed to a different heritage. This is Delft. The image on the right is where I grew up. My parents' house is probably 30, 40 meters away from the old church. And so the old church is 1246. The new church is 1400. So the idea of what's old and new is really fungible. It really depends on where you sit and how you look at it and where you are. And so as a result of that, I come here, and on my first field trip up the Hudson River, they put me in front of this church. My reaction, it's not Dutch, it's classical. They didn't tell me about Dutch reform as a religion. But the other part was, it's only 19th century. And so again, the idea as to what heritage is and how significant it is and where it fits is really a function as to how you arrive at the scene and how you get into it. Similarly about windmills. This particular one is mid-18th century. It's mills that pump water from a polder into the canal next to it. And then and then a friend of mine sent me this one from Atlanta. He says, well, it's a windmill, it's Dutch, it's thrifty, it's your nationality. And then the other side, of course, is the celebration of what you see very much in the Midwest, in Western Michigan, the idea of going back to a heritage that is really something very different for them. And then you go to the Tulip Festival. And I must tell you, this was probably one of the most amazing experiences. But because I arrived here in a three-piece suit to see everybody wearing something that presumes to be Dutch. There were more wooden shoes than I've seen in my entire life. And I can't imagine walking on the street like that. So you can see again how these images of heritage, the memories of that heritage, how it gets molded and used in different ways, depending on where you are and how you approach it. And then there's another side. These are two cartoons that I collected out of American magazines. On the left side, of course, goes back to Hans Brinker and his finger the dike. But on the right side, it's talking about a nationality that presumably is very tolerant. And then more recently, in the discussion that we're all having about racism and inequality, then about a month ago, I read an article. This is part of an exhibit at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which is the major national museum, of a portrait of 1680. The man on the horse is a nephew of William and Mary. But on the left side, you can see there is a small child holding a helmet, which has a collar. And that collar is basically a slave band. And so here we're suddenly being confronted, at least from my personal point of view, I'm being confronted with the fact that there's a whole other piece of heritage that we didn't talk about. We didn't talk about it in high school, we didn't talk about it in college. And so they always rediscover is indeed peeling back those kind of memories and perceptions is really constantly part of what I believe heritage is all about and how we should approach it. The other part that I want to talk for a few minutes about is what we see culturally as modern design influences. And they're pretty straightforward. It's the Bauhaus, 1920s in Dessau. It's the Museum of Modern Art, of course, again, bringing the Bauhaus and its heritage to the United States. It is Cranbrook of Eliel Salmons in the 1920s and 1930s. And then, of course, as we experience it in popular culture, and I picked Madman as an example, but I think, again, you can look at many of the other shows. But I think that what's important here, that we begin to look back behind the screen and begin to understand what this is all about. It's not about aesthetics. Yes, I mean, there isn't part of aesthetics, but it's more about what's behind there. And so what I want to talk about tonight is really done looking at it from a wellness point of view. That's the literature. The literature, both in the past and in the contemporary. One of the important books that I think we don't pay much attention to as we should is Jacob Riis' How the Other Half Lives, because it talks about conditions at the end of the 19th century, in this particular case in New York City, but really talking about urban America. And I think if you begin to think about modernism as a reaction or as a kind of way of dealing with issues of social inequity, but also with social aspect of health and wellness. And again, these are just two images out of the book to illustrate the kind of conditions that were taking place, which were, again, looking at the image itself doesn't really give you the full scope. Think about the smell. Think about the light. Think about all the other parts that really that are missing in these images, or that you really don't necessarily fully realize. Two more images. This discussion is still going. We're still looking at it. These are two more recent publications. The topography of wellness actually came out this year. The Sanitary City talks about another part of the development at the end of the 19th century, which is dealing with diseases, dealing with the engineering of the city in order to improve the quality of life. And of course, again, I'm using a cover of the Metropolis magazine of about 2-3 years ago. And of course, the Modernization of Architecture as a publication that was done by the CCA in Montreal. And so I think if you keep that in mind, you can begin to realize that, for example, planning is an integral part of that. We see that in this particular case, looking at Joseph Hoffman, to Wagner, in terms of beginning to regularize. It's not just the formality in terms of the static presentation, but it is also begin to clean up and organize and begin to deal with things like light, air, sanitation, transportation. And I have three images of just beginning to talk about again, Ebenezer Howard and his Garden City. So tomorrow, again, dealing with the idea of bringing quality of life to the environment. And finally, of course, Corbusier and his plan for Paris in the 1920s. I mean, in many ways, we're happy this never got built, but as a spirit, as an exploration of improving the quality of life, both in terms of the minimum dimensions and in terms of the quality of life as experienced in health and wellness. And that brings me to two things. It brings me to the discussion of fresh air. And fresh air is very much part of what we talk about today. And which is why I thought it would be interesting to sort of look back a little bit. Because a lot of what we're discussing in the pandemic is actually not new. The imagery is not new, the issues are not new, the words are new. And so the whole discussion of fresh air at the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, was very, very critical to this discussion of what health and wellness is all about. The 19th century was talking about ventilation a great deal. And these are diagrams about 1899, trying to explore the quality of the environment inside and what it could do by introducing fresh air into that. And there's this wonderful lecture in the Smithsonian in the 1870s where it says something along the line that man's worst enemy is his own breath. I mean, for us, it means something different, but they're really talking about the fact that the unventilation is part of giving us conditions that we don't like. So we begin to see this idea of looking for fresh air as part of a health diet. And it may be very hard for us to imagine that putting your kid in a cage out the window is part of that, but think about it. It has to do with a time that there is no mechanical ventilation, there's no air conditioning, and again, there's no other way to do this. So I think in many ways, it sort of symbolizes, in many ways, what comes ahead. There's the other part, which is air as part of the exploration of tuberculosis. And we'll come back to that in a minute. And I'm just using as an example here the Lovell Health House by Richard Neuter of the mid-1920s, where you can see that become from an intellectual point of view, introducing the swimming pool, introducing exercise equipment, introducing fresh air into the space, begins to become part of a design process that it begin well accept. Again, this is an image of the Lovell House, so you can see the swimming pool on the second floor, and on the right side, you see again a view of the swimming pool. And again, beginning to introduce the idea that you have equipment for exercise, the idea that calisthenics and other exercises are part of your well-being, becomes part of a cultural pattern, both for the wealthy and the not so wealthy. That brings me to the other part, back to the city, the introduction of the children's playground. There's a man in Boston, Lee, at the end of the 19th century, who gets very instrumental in beginning to bring playgrounds into the city. It has two purposes. It has the purpose of creating an exercise and energy burning equipment for the children, but it also to keep them off the street. From our point of view, of course, this looks pretty unhealthy, or not healthy, unsafe, because there's no safety equipment, and clearly they're climbing all over the place. but you can see that beginning to introduce this part of a concept is very important. This evolves itself. And certainly by the 1940s, we see that most major city parks, like for example, there's one in New York City, have playgrounds where children can be on outside, interact and recreate in the outside world. There are many examples of how that evolves, particularly in the 60s and 70s. And this is one of the Paul Friedberg's adventure playgrounds, again in New York City in Central Park, whereby the kid can explore a different kind of construction in order to develop motoric skills and recreate as being desired. From a preservation point of view, this becomes complicated because many of these playgrounds are dismantled or changed because our perception of play has changed, and we are far more safety conscious than in, say, our parents or our grandparents were in terms of the injury that are taking place. Fresh air. So there's this organization in the Midwest in the 19 teens and 20s called Fresh Open Air Crusaders. And they developed this whole idea of teaching in the open air. It's an example of the open air school. Becomes a major development, not just in the Midwest, but across the world. It becomes a typology that is you'll find everywhere. But the other part that's interesting is about it. Principles of this concept we find back in school design today. And the idea, the relationship for the child and the relationship to the environment around it. They had special uniforms. Maybe uniforms is not the right word. Maybe I should say special clothing. And you see on the right side, the snow is around them. I can't imagine they're learning a lot. But that's what it shows. This is a school in Chicago, but not only they talk about the publication, not only talks about the importance of fresh air as a health benefit, it talks about the fresh air as a prevention for tuberculosis, and they talk about the importance of nutrition. Because I think one of the things we don't pay attention to is the other parts of what life and buildings make happen, which is things like nutrition. If you think back about Jacob Riis's images, you think about the diet that people had, you can imagine that it wasn't very healthy. And so there's a whole larger complex of influences and parts of the puzzle that begin to play a role and that we actually need to pay more attention to. Again, school in St. Louis, and an example of an outdoor classroom. Again, the school in St. Louis, again, they're sitting there very well packed in their thermal clothing because clearly it's very cold outside. So we get these very special school buildings. So this is a very famous one in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, called the Open Air School. Designed by a man called Jan Duiker, 1929, 1930, something like that. What's stunning about it is two things. It's the transparency of the architecture. And you're looking at the balconies, both on the left and the right side images, which are essentially open air classrooms. So everything could be opened up, but they also could move out of the classroom onto the balcony. This school looks like this. This is an actual recent photograph. It's in the middle of a city block. The schools still exist and are examples of kids are still going there. The building has been recently restored. The windows that you see here have been replaced. They're back to the original because what they did in the 1950s and 60s is they replaced all the steel windows with aluminum windows, which means that the architectural impression of the openers is completely changed. And they put it back, and you can see the transparency, which is so much part of the architectural impression of the building. I've got two more examples because it's really important to understand how important this typology was, certainly just before World War II, in terms of education, not only as education as a pedagogy, but education a as a way of helping kids being healthy and productive. This is a French example myself with Jean Boudin, mid-1930s, generally referred to as a pavilion school, because you can see in the image that the classrooms are totally separate. So rather than having in one building, there's a central building that we see on the left, where most of the major amenities are located, and on the right there is separate classrooms. An example of the ideal circumstance: the sun is shining and the windows are open and the kids are working inside the space. So you can see again this whole idea of how important fresh air is in the experience of and in the quality of life for the children. Still, we're looking at the French example. We see the same thing here. And again, we're coming back to Richard Neutra, the Corona School. The school still exists in California. And again, it has that same kind of concept that it could just one wall of the classroom can be moved out of the way in order to get the full benefit of the open air. I must say, in California, it sounds a little bit more logical than Chicago in the middle of the winter. But the spirit, of course, is the same spirit that's taking place. Again, an early color photograph of that Corona school. And then you come to today. And you see that actually, when I showed you the beginning, the image of the 19th century ventilation, this is in 21st century example, but the issues are still the same. We're still dealing with ventilation, dealing with separation, and trying to create the quality of air that's needed in the classroom. And this is a piece out of the New York Times, actually from this Sunday. There's a whole story about the fact that kids bring monitors to school in their package to be able, and their parents, of course, being able to monitor the quality of air that they're being exposed to. So I think we have taken the next step in that sense. But you can see the concerns are still very much the same. And then you think about what's happened to us in the pandemic. I can imagine this. This is a Mexican restaurant at Columbus Avenue, but I can imagine this the classroom. And we can be straight back into the 1920s in terms of the kind of exposure and the kind of solutions we're finding for the problems around us. The other part of the discussion is heliotherapy. And again, to me, that's interesting because it talks about changing perceptions. This whole idea that the healing benefits of the sun was particularly in the early part of the 20th century, was being developed particularly by a man called Laurier in Switzerland. That's part of a procedure to make people healthier. Of course, very much to do in that particular case with tuberculosis. And tuberculosis is something that up until the 1950s was probably the second or the third largest cause of death in many parts of the world, but also in America, certainly in the 1910s and 20s. And the sunlight and open air was considered part of a regime, not for a cure, but at least create remission. Because the cure, of course, doesn't happen until the introduction of antibiotics and the availability of forensic equipment that allows for the diagnosis. But again, these are images of the 1910s and 1920s. The one in the middle is Switzerland, and the one on the far right is Dutch. And again, the words Sonnenstrahl means ray of sunshine as part of the celebration of what they were trying to do. This is the clinic of Mr. Rodier in Switzerland. And you can see kids lying on beds exposed to the outside air and the sunlight. Well, in the background, you can see skiers on the slope. So again, part of that sort of same idea of this open air school concept is translated here in exposure to fresh air. And again, of course, diet as an example of creating better, healthier individuals. They went as far as doing this inside. This image is a glass structure, but the glass itself is a particular glass. It was advertised in the 1910s and 20s as Vita glass. And you look at the diagram, and it shows you that because of the prismatic quality of the glass, it was able to not filter out some of the UV light. Which for us, of course, we have questions of melanoma and other implications, but clearly from their point of view, having these healthy rays of these beneficial rays there as part of the indoor environment was very critical. It was advertised very heavily in the news, in the trade literature, both in America and in the United Kingdom. So what we arrive at then is a building typology, which is the sanatorium. And we see across the world, whether it's in Mexico, into Europe, or in America, we see the development of a typology between, I would say, the 1890s and the 1940s that are aimed at being people in an environment that exposes them to the air and the sunlight for the purposes of bringing benefits to TB patients. And this particular one from Joseph Hoffman, it's very simple. It's still the late 19th century. It's very blocky. But what's interesting about it is the color palette. I'll come back to that in a minute. But if you look at the interior finishes, again, of course, Joseph Hoffman, as part of his shown, is very much Macintoshian in its impression. But there is a lightness to it. And I mean that both literally and figuratively, that you begin to see as part of a beneficial part to create that wellness that we were looking for. This is Sommerstrahl, the sanatorium designed by Jan Duiker and Bernard Dijvoet, the late 1920s, the early 1930s. This particular one, the image that you see here, is the left side is the 1950s. On the right side, you see the original configuration that was finished in the 1930s. When I was in architectural school, the building was closed. After the TB was less of an issue in the 1950s, the building had been converted into a hospital, but didn't work very well as a hospital, had been expanded, as you can see on the left, and then was then abandoned. And so this building becomes the sort of cause célèbre for Docomomo. It is where the origination of the development of Docomomo starts. Because two people involved in the restoration or the efforts to preserve it then realize this is an issue that is not just related to this building. It's not just related to this building typology, but it's related to an architecture of the 1930s, the interwar period, between World War I and World War II. And they start an organization called Docomomo in the late 1980s with 13 participants. And what you see on the right is the building as it originally was designed. It has long galleries with rooms that open up to the gallery so that the beds could be moved out or beds could be placed in the gallery and the exposure to the sunlight could take place. On the right side shows you the condition in the 1980s and 1990s before any restoration took place. This is what it looks like today. And it's an interesting exercise because it's an interesting exercise on a number of different levels. Part of it is the restoration itself from a technical point of view. Because if you look at the concrete slabs, they're probably 4 inches, 5 inches, which for concrete in the 1920s is pretty audacious. Second, it is the transparency, but the same transparency we saw a little bit earlier in the school in Amsterdam. Today, of course, our energy requirements are different. And so the challenge here was, how do you make the building more energy, not efficient, but more energy friendly and better interior climate for people working and being there. And so they created insulated glass. And the insulated glass was used in the spaces that are occupied. Insulated glass was not used in the spaces that were corridors, because again, you would pass through those. It means that I have two pieces of glass. The other part that's really unique about this is that the insulated glass is custom made. And I think I was telling the students a few minutes ago, is that glass production changed significantly at the end of the 1950s. And the introduction of float glass. And float glass is perfect. Of course, in the 1930s, they didn't have float glass. So if you wanted to preserve the original appearance, you needed to sort of come to a compromise. So what they did is they made insulated glass with drawn sheet glass, as was in the 1930s on the outside, and float glass in the inside. So they made a compromise in order to make that happen. It was custom-made glass. And so you can see they solved the technical problem. The other problem was, of course, what do you do with it? Because the typology is obsolete because of the particular purpose of where it was designed. And so what happened here is a adaptation to an ambulatory care facility. That's what happened in the early 2000s. I'm told the building is empty again. So again, we'll see what happens next. But again, trying to find an adaptive use or find a continued use that was both sympathetic to the original as well as was really supportive to the building itself. But I think the other part of the history is the original history. I think this is part of what makes it, for me, very interesting. The facility was built through funds provided by the Diamond Workers Union in Amsterdam. And the man would, for a period of time, set aside their drinking money on a weekly basis in order to make this happen. And so if you remember the poster that we saw a few minutes ago, in Dutch it says, the strong ones to support the weak ones. And so the idea there was a social compact, the idea there was a social responsibility for well-being that I think is kind of unique and sort of something we should remember more closely these days going forward. Again, here the same thing we saw in the Joseph Hoffman example. It's the lightness of the palette, the coloration. On the right side, you see the sampling of the paint color, and on the left side, you see the example of what that paint color resulted. In order to increase the capacity, by the way, of the sanitarium, they also built these little huts. These are unheated huts open to the air somewhere on the property where people slept and lived in order to get maximum benefits with sun and air. The other part that was an integral part of, particularly since the early part of the 20th century, is the idea that if the disease went into remission, that people should be reintroduced into the workplace. In other words, they should learn a skill, but they also should build up their strength to go back to the workplace. And an example like here, and also some of the English example before World War I, had very active workshops in order to make things, in order to be able to support people in terms of returning to the workplace when they were healthy again. Two more examples, or actually three more examples. This is Aalto. This is Paimio Sanatorium in Finland. About 2 years ago, it was for sale. I don't know who bought it or anybody bought it, but again, because the original purpose doesn't exist anymore, the building was at one point on the market. I think it's a World Heritage Site, and I'm sure that the preservation of that building was very critical, but to begin to see how the topology in its obsolescence requires us to look for different solutions. Again, long galleries, exposure to the sun, and orientation is important. And again, as we saw earlier, the coloration of that, the openness and the color of it is very critical to the appearance of it. The Mayor, Belgium, and Tombeek. This one was empty for probably 20 years, in pretty bad condition. I had a thesis student doing a thesis for me about 8 years ago in the building, but more recently that's been remodeled and been reused as an elderly care facility. So again, they found a use that's appropriate to the building, and it has been redeveloped. And just using one American example in Illinois, this is actually part of a museum installation. But again, it's similar in terms of the long gallery and the typology that got saved as part of the history of the town. But this aspect of heliotherapy is also in the private residency, not just in the Richard Northrup design house in California, but also just by looking at Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie. And if you go upstairs to the 3rd floor, you see the circular addition to the top. It's essentially an orientation and a shell to capture the sunlight. So you get clearly the idea of heliotherapy, the exposure to the sun, as being very, very beneficial. And not just only found in clinics, but also found in private residencies. And then think about the spin-offs. Think about all the other aspects that come into it. When you think about furniture, Joseph Hoffman's Sitz machine, which is really an adjustable chair designed for a sanatorium in the late 19th century. The famous Adirondack chair, designed for initially as Westwood for a sanatorium in the Adirondacks run by a man called Prudon. And of course, Corbusier and Perriot in its Chazon, alto, back to alto in its chair by Neo, and a variation that he did a little later. And of course, Corbusier, again, doing the Chazon, not for the purposes of any medical purpose, but you can see how the topologies begin to blend and how it all comes together as furniture. I have very little in color. I just wanted to bring it back for a minute just to the conversation that we see in these buildings, how color is part of the perception of wellness, how important it is in supporting that healthy environment. And again, I'm using the Villa Savoie because Corbu is very much into the coloration. These are the colors as the Villa Savoie is exposed to recapture colorations over the were done. One of the major living room, look at the wall, look at the color relationship, and then of course look at his color guides in the 1930s. You can see how it comes to making a relationship. But he talks about harmony. He talks about the feelings and the feelings it engenders. So again, back to this whole healthy wellness aspect that we were talking about before. Enough the past, a little bit about what we're doing today. I think I have three examples of cases that are current. And I have one, I'll end as any good architect for the project that I'm working on. And basically to sort of share with you the kind of thinking that needs to go into it. The challenges that I see today is what I call style, scale, and scope. We talked a little bit about this earlier, this rolling aspect of style coming forward. Where we called the Victorians ugly, we didn't like Art Deco, and we're now talking about brutalism and postmodernism. But again, it's part of the rolling development of style and coming to us. The second part is scale. Buildings have gotten ever bigger since the 1850s. So the sheer size of the buildings we need to deal with has become much larger than ever before, which means that the scope of intervention, what we can do or we can do, it becomes much more complicated. It is one thing to restore a townhouse or to restore a farmhouse for George Washington. It's something else to deal with a 50-story skyscraper. And so the decision process, the criteria, the level of significance becomes a very different discussion. The other part that I think is very critical is the discussion between public and private. I think what's been happening since the 1970s is that more of private, because of the scope and scale, the influence of private funding has become much more critical. But it also begins to affect the public benefit, the public access. And I think it's tension that really we begin to see more and more. And I worry about it because I think it begins to defeat the whole concept of public benefit and the merits of preservation or any kind of other activity that is for all our good. And of course, finally, it's always discussion about material. Example, postmodernism. Michael Gray's public service building in Portland. Finished in the early 1980s. It never really worked. Great deal of complaints about the conditions of the fabric. Has undergone a major renovation, I think $250 million worth, and the exterior cladding has been changed. There's been discussion as to whether it should be taken off the National Register. So you begin to see that the problematic of the materiality is both in terms of the long-term interpretation and in terms of what the kind of interventions that we're doing. Thompson Center in Chicago, designed by Helmut Jahn in the mid-1980s. I just saw in a newspaper article that this building has been out for bid, for sale, which means ultimately demolition, because it's a very valuable site in downtown Chicago. And I think they have two bids. So it'll be interesting to see what will happen in the next couple of months in terms of what will happen to this building. What's interesting about it, and I'm sure I didn't keep the image, but one of the proposals has been to put a mill tower next to it, sort of glued back onto it, which is really kind of the solutions we've been using since the 1970s to deal with smaller scale buildings in high density environments or in high real estate value environments. And public-private. Here we see the Firehouse campus designed by Skidmore in the 1970s. Peter Walker is the landscape architect. It's a really interesting project. It's called the Groundscaper because what they really did is extended the building out over the ground in a very significant landscape environment. Firehouse abandoned the campus, like many of the American corporations did their campuses at the end of the World War II. And so the battle is going on right now with both the town and the developers, what's going to happen to it. Then materials for myself. It's a project I'm working on currently. It's Wallace Harrison's first Presbyterian church in Stamford, Connecticut. The photograph that you see here, as obvious from the cars in the front, is the mid-1950s when it was finished. It's essentially a precast structure with dull de verre or prismatic glass infill panels that are slanted. So it's not a folded plate structure, it's just leaning precast panels. This is what it looks like on the inside. And so it's what you would call in the 19th century, an awe-inspiring pile. But what's happened here, I'm looking toward the front of the church, I'm looking towards the chancel. On the right side is the north elevation, and on the left side is going to south. The north elevation is the original 1950s glass made by a man called Gabriel Loire in the studio outside the house. On the left side is a 1980s replacement of that 1950s glass. It was replaced in the 1950s because it was falling apart. The irony, of course, now is that what you see on the left side is actually falling apart again. So 30 years later, it began to deteriorate in a major way. So the challenge that we have is how to repair this and not making the same mistakes they made in the 50s and in the 80s. And not to have to go back in another 30 years. Precast panels, it's an early version of panels made by a company in Long Island. It's pretty good precast, and you see the large voids in that. The voids are being filled with this kind of belle de verre. They're using the French word for slabs of glass or prismatic glass you would use in America. This is the actual structure going in, and you can see the panels are leaning against each other. And I'm looking at the narthex from the northeast. Because Loire Studio still exists, it's now operated by the sons. And what you're looking at here are half-scale maquettes of the individual panels. In other words, they mocked everything up. We don't have any real drawings for it. And so the challenge we have now is how do we recreate what was there originally? How do we use what is there now from the 1980s? And how do we make sure that it survives much better than we did before? This is what it looks like. It's an inch thick concrete. This is original panel in the 1950s. It's an inch thick concrete poured in place. So basically the glass, slabs of glass that get hammered, so they shatter and they have prismatic effect. They set in concrete and then mounted into the precast. The material they did in the 1980s, they didn't use precast, they didn't use concrete, they used epoxy. The American tradition of making this material in the 1970s changed from concrete to epoxy, but again, the rest of the configurations would be quite the same. This is what it looks like today. So the glass is shattering, breaking up, salts are leaching out of it, and it's fracturing and shattering almost like a tempered glass, shatters little glass fragments. Again, looking at from the inside, close up. So we do it on the bottom right. You see an original precast drawing done by a British engineer who worked on the Festival of Britain. The top drawing is a point cloud scan of the entire building because you can't really measure it, and you don't really need to measure it, but you still like to document what you have. And on the bottom left is a thermal scan looking at how the wall performs on the different conditions. We've started the first phase. What you see is the scaffolding going up in the narthex. This particular phase is really an exploratory phase to try out all the tests we can. We're looking at a lot of materials that are still being made and trying to come to criteria. One of the interesting parts is if you can really see on the right side, just about above the blue scaffold, is that very early on in the 1950s, they put additional glass over all the bare panels. And we think it was probably done pretty much part of the original construction. Those panels are in very good condition, and it's the original glass. So one of the things we're exploring right now is to see whether we can do additional glazing at the exterior, particularly on the south elevation, because if you think about it, the way the panel is angled, you look at the angle of the sun, particularly in the wintertime, these panels go on a daily basis to temperature variations of 150 degrees, from down -10 to 150 above. So again, mitigating that environmental stress is one of the strategies we're looking at. That's what I wanted to share with you. As you can see, I sort of like this 1920s French poster. It's better to think ahead. It's better than to do it after the fact. Thank you very much.
If you wouldn't mind when you take the questions, could you
Any comments or questions? Any thoughts? Yes, sir. I think that your question is your question is really about the value of the authenticity of the original material. Whether saving that is paramount as a preservation philosophy, and whether, of course, the challenge we have today with the fact that these modern materials fall apart much more quickly for whatever reason. How do you interpret that? I think from my perspective, in the discussion about preserving modern architecture, in the beginning, well, this was very much the case. We all argued about the fact that keeping the original material was paramount to the concept of preservation. And I think we talked a little earlier about the lever house as an example, where the entire replacement of the skin with a new material and a newly designed, keeping the original design elements in terms of the aesthetics intact, is an example of where the technology becomes necessary. And so I think for me, I've sort of migrated in that direction. I don't see the need to repeat the original mistake for the purposes of preserving something. I think the interesting, I don't know if you followed the case of Phenomenal Hall by Aalto in Helsinki. Designed I think in the 50s. It was clad entirely in white Carrara marble. That Carrara marble began to do what marble does, and white marble does, begins to cup. And so at the end of the 90s, they decided that it would become to the condition that it was too severely deteriorated. They needed to replace it because it becomes a hassle because it's breaking out of its anchoring system. And the initial idea was to replace it with a white Chinese granite or a white granite. Mrs. Aalto led a campaign to say what he wanted was white Carrara because it was part of the original concept, the glistening part of the stone on the water. It got replaced with Carrara marble. They made some adjustments in the thickness of the marble. They made some adjustments in the anchoring systems in order to try to prevent the cupping from happening again. But in a decade, it's cupping. But the real interesting part is it's cupping in the other direction. And so at some point, they got to replace it again. Well, if you then think about that part of it, are they going to go back to marble? I seriously doubt it, because then I think the aspect of the public interest, the public benefit begins to not outweigh the original, not outweigh the cost of the exercise. So I think, again, these are balances that are depending on the building, its significance, the technology, and of course, the cost of it. I realize this is a complicated answer to your question, but I think it's a complicated issue. Any other thoughts? Yes, sir. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm thinking that the scope of what we need to deal with has seen the rise of public-private partnerships, because from a government public benefit, public funding point of view, they're no longer available. What I worry about is with that also comes a change in interest. And so let me take Central Park as an example. In the 1960s, the park was a very bad condition. And so they developed a model by which private funding could help support the maintenance and restoration of the park. So far, so good. And then we have a major concert that closes the park and requires people to pay, and basically benefits come back to the park. And again, to me, then it gets complicated. I mean, I see the benefits, I see the process. I just wonder about at what point, and again, the park's not a good example of that, but I'm just trying to use it as a sort of illustration of the process. I worry about it. But at the same time, I think if you look at the Monument Historique in France, where for, let's say, at the end of the 20th century, the budgets were 90% went to Gothic cathedrals and 10% for the rest. That was also not sustainable. Yes, sir.
Fresh air. How do you see the ongoing value of those paradigms? Is it possible as we go back to an aspect of the world or somewhere that we might really enjoy a building with a wall, door outdoor space, things like that? See some things like that, or it seems to be part of your interest in making.
Well, I think the reason I'm raising it, it's my interest in how history repeats itself,
Okay.
and how we deal with it. And I'm really struck by graphically some of the images that, just looking at ventilation, without getting into any kind of judgmental or any kind of, how we still revisit that same issue. I think that's one part. I think the other part where I'm sort of pondering is the collective response to that, and what we learned from that response in the past and in the present. And that I think what I like about the Roman-style sanatorium is the fact that its original construction was a collective response to making life better. And as the poster says, it's the strong ones to support the weak ones. And again, from a personal point of view, as a moral, for lack of a better word, moral concept appeals to me. Do I know what the ultimate outcome will be physically? I have no doubt that criteria of ventilation will change. The same way that the criteria for the ventilation changed after all the outbreaks of Legionnaire disease. So I think there will be a physical impact, but whether there will be a cultural impact and how we translate that into the physical reality, that's what I'm curious about. Yes. I'm not sure I fully heard all of that. I'm not sure I really heard what you asked me. The difference between what and what? Oh, I think both of them are equally frustrating, just for different reasons. I think the major difference is that the concept of preservation is probably in the classical European context more accepted as a process. That doesn't mean people don't bicker about it. Of course they do. But here, I think because the concept is more a populist-driven concept. And to me, the most stunning part is every time I heard a conversation in the beginning when I was here, oh, you can't do that, it's unconstitutional. I think that's the point. You think it's a very different way of looking at it. And the best way to describe it is that the relationship and ownership in relationship to property is different. And in America, it's an inalienable right. I think historically in Europe, it was an inalienable responsibility. I think as a result that your approach changes. I think right now, of course, it's mixed in both sides, but I think from an historic point of view, that would be what would be the way I would describe it. All right. Oh, good.
One of the things that the short interval and also the obsolescence of building types or configuration. And then on the other hand, the desire to preserve. And I wonder how that brings that in your mind. I think projects are with
Yeah, I think the question of obsolescence, the question how you deal with the materiality, I think you got to look at it. Let me go about it in a different way. If you look at prior to the end of the 18th century, there were very few typologies, because there were very few activities that required specialty building types. I think as we go through the 19th century and come into the 20th and 21st century, we begin to specialize activities within particular building topologies. Because of that, the change in the use of the building becomes far more critical. It's like if you gain 2 inches and if you gain 2 pounds, your pants don't fit anymore. And that kind of fitting exercise for purpose is there. I think the other part is that we're really not paying attention to the financial structure. If you think about it, most financial instruments these days, like your mortgage, is a 7-year fixed and variable after that, because the expectation is that you won't be in that house after 7 years. And so the mobility and the change in finance has changed. And so we are therefore caught between building buildings on a short-term basis for use and the short-term basis for occupancy. And so we're creating ourselves a durability problem. And so a part of what I think will happen is we will have to reconstruct, we'll build more buildings than we have before. I mean, we have examples of them in our history. I mean, if you look at Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, that started out as a paper mache Panama Canal celebration, and therefore was translated to concrete, or the Parthenon in Nashville, same conversation. But I think that will happen more to us because the finality of the building material is much more prominent than it was ever before. mean, Plaza Italia by Charlie Moore in New Orleans, I think, has seen at least 2 restorations. And it's what, 1970s? So I think we'll have a burden to that. But I think it's part of the larger issue. It's part of the issue we need to make decisions as to what to keep. And I think one of the big things we constantly talk about is preservation is a reactive exercise, which is why I like this poster. We should be thinking about ahead of the game. And so therefore identifying what we want to keep and being more active in trying to keep it is probably a better way of doing it than trying to come in at the end and try to cure that. But it's very complicated because again, I think at the end of the day, you find yourself as an active practitioner having to make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. I can't give you a straightforward philosophy because I think I can give you an intention, but I can't give you the answer. And again, adaptive use is a word that for the first time appears in the probably late 60s, early 70s. But that was a word that didn't exist before.
Thank you so much. We have a reception up here for your freshmen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.